Good afternoon. My name is Ellis Wohlner, and I will be moderating this seminar. I'm on the board of RTVD, and I have the pleasure of having 5 distinguished people on the panel, but since for practical reasons they're not going to sit up here until later on when we have a panel discussion and take some questions from the audience, they will come up one at a time, so I will introduce them as they come up. Why did RTV decide to organize this very important seminar? It's not a debate about assisted dying. It's to try to influence our legislature and our government to finally put on place an investigation into possible assisted dying in Sweden. RTVD is now 47 years old. In Oregon, they've already had legally assisted dying for 25 years. Spain took a law in the spring of this year. In the Catholic, rather conservative Spain, they have adopted such a law. And in Sweden, we are still not getting an investigation made. This has to change. The way the seminar will be conducted is in very loose form, is that each of our panelists will make a presentation. Some of them will have a second turn at presentation for various reasons. And then later on, we will open up for some inter-panel discussion and also for questions and comments, both from the live audience and from the audience that is watching digitally. But we ask you, when you do make an intervention, not to make a speech, to make a short question or comment. You may be critical if you want to, but we're not having a debate as such about assisted dying. I would like to just show you one slide about the terminology. So while we were waiting, I would just once again, I will say it many times, express my appreciation for our participants coming from Oregon and from Canada and from Germany, and a lawyer here from Sweden to help us in this endeavor. We have some people in the audience from Iceland and from Norway and from France, and you're all very welcome. We're very happy that you're able to come here today. It's coming. As you can say, as far as terminology, there's a lot of different expressions used in the discussion, both in Sweden and in other countries. So I am referring to, we have a state medical ethical board advising the government, SMER på svenska, and they have made these definitions. And they made a major report 4 years ago in Swedish, but it was translated into English, and these are their terms in English. No, that's not the slide. That's much later. It's the terminology one. Here we go. Okay, as I said, the National Council on Medical Ethics, SMER, uses the following definitions. Assisted dying, in Swedish dödshjälp, is the overarching term for procedures that will lead to a patient's death. Self-administered assisted dying, assisterat döende på svenska, is the term for when patients themselves perform the decisive act. And euthanasia, euthanasie, is the term for when a person other than the patient performs the decisive action. And I have a little note down at the bottom, I think it was coined in Canada, made medical assistance in dying is a very useful expression. So with all those things said, I would like to first call on Staffan Bergström, the chairman of RTVD, to make a presentation about RTVD itself. Later on, he will come back in another capacity. Please, Staffan.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm honored as a chairperson of RTVD since 2.5 years to present a few words within a very limited time about this movement. So RTVD, can we have the first slide? RTVD was created in 1974, 47 years ago. And we can ask now, after these 47 years, what lessons can be drawn from our history. We heard that, and we will hear that Canada has been very much more successful than Sweden, and in 1980 they started the whole movement that led to, in 2015, to a change, and from 2016 they have the law permitting assisted death as we understood it. Now in Sweden we had RTVD created in 1947, and there was obviously not a single moment, a dramatic thing having shaped the whole idea of RTVD. One key person from the beginning was Professor Ingemar Hedenius, who was a professor of practical philosophy, and he was followed by a religious person, a priest called Morten Werner, who was very important for the whole continuation and of RTVD in the early years of our association. The two people collaborated obviously fairly well. Professor Hedenius was a very well-known atheist, and Morten Werner was a very well-known Christian priest, and he was also a parliamentarian in the Swedish parliament. Now, looking back, well before we had the association, next slide. So ending one's life was considered a sin until 1850s, and it was not punishable law in Sweden from 1856. And that is important because even helping a person to end his or her life was criminal to that time. Now it's not criminal to help a person to end his or her life anymore. Next slide. We can see that the relationship between being a sin and the church change in opinion. In 1908, the funeral was considered normal, or was normalized in Sweden, even after a suicide, ending one's life himself or herself. Now, we have witnessed over the years since 1947, when RTVD was created, a lot of resistance. And we have identified over these last years a number of resistance sources where we have tactically and strategically tried to approach these sources. And from the creation in, next slide, from the creation in 1974, we have identified these sources of resistance, and I have tried to summarize them, next slide, in the so-called 5 Ps. And that is not a play with words, but it so happens that these main resistance sources are these 5. And the next slide. We have pensioners organizations, SPF and PRO. SPF has recently changed their mind and become more open and more accessible to demand an analysis in the Swedish Parliament to have a thorough examination of the conditions for a legalization of assisted dying. PRO is empirically very much more reluctant, if I could say also resistant, and I have personally lectured in both organizations, SPF and PRO, and PRO is considering this topic very sensitive, obviously, and they have not been able to take up at the annual conferences any decision in support of an analysis in the Parliament. Number two, not unexpectedly, priests, religious organizations. We have a number of well-known representative theologians and professors and priests, one bishop, etc., who has been active in supporting an analysis at the parliamentarian level. And as I said, Morten Werner was the second chairperson in RTVD at the very beginning of our history. But the third source of resistance is a very most important, and that is parliamentarians and political parties. We have made various visits to parliamentarians and to parties, and there have been a number of interpellations in the parliament in order to have this issue brought forward. But I think it's about in 2008 we had the first attempt, but that was nothing happened after that. And we have made several other attempts. And now we have had a network being shaped in the parliament with various parliamentarians being in favor of an analysis and an scrutiny of the arguments in favor of and against assisted dying. So we have hopes that the parties will come to a conclusion more and more, and we have the women's part of these parties have been in the forefront of a change and being very supportive. Number 4, palliative care specialists. Somehow we have met resistance from these people who have a lot of experience in taking care of dying patients, terminally ill patients. And we have tried to call upon them for conferences, and one conference where we had invited a Belgian very well-known professor. That meeting was boycotted by the palliative care specialists. And we have argued since the very beginning that palliative care belongs to RTVD's objectives. Improved palliative care, quantitatively and qualitatively, that is a very important thing. But we believe that assisted dying should be integrated with palliative care when there is no other way out of care in the dying period. And lastly, number 5, patients' organizations for disabled patients. And we have also approached, there are specific organizations catering to brain tumor organizations, abdominal tumor organizations, and other specific tumor organizations. and we're in the process of having a dialogue with them. Now, this resistance has made Sweden to witness over many years now so-called tourism in Sweden for self-administered dying. Next slide. And we consider it highly discriminatory to have people making the enormous effort to translate in English the whole medical record from the beginning to the end, and having a lot of documents presented in English to the Swiss organizations helping even foreigners to end their lives. So we have a tourism to Switzerland for self-administered assisted dying. Now, this phenomenon is discriminatory both when it comes to capacity to translate the whole medical record, but also very discriminatory in terms of the cost. It could cost up to 25,000 US dollars, or 250,000 Swedish crowns to have it processed from the beginning to the end. Now, this reminds me, and I would like to end up this brief presentation about one very important person. Next slide. Brittany Maynard, who was a Californian lady, 28, 29 years old, who had been diagnosed with glioblastoma, one of the most malignant brain tumors that we know of. And in California at that time, in 2014, there was no access to any person with a terminal disease having access to assistance dying. So Brittany Maynard moved to nearby Oregon, where, as Ellis said earlier, there was a legislation in place, and Brittany Maynard moved there with all her family. And I'm going to show a few minutes of a very famous film that brings her fate to us. And I think I show it because this was also a medical tourism from California to Oregon, much like the medical tourism, the death-assisted dying tourism that we have seen in Sweden.
So if November 2nd comes along and I've passed, I hope my family is still proud of me and the choices I made. And if November 2nd comes along and I'm still alive, I know that we'll just still be moving forward as a family, like out of love for each other, and that decision will come later. When people criticize me for not like waiting longer, or whatever they've decided is best for me, it hurts, because really I risk it every day that I wake up. And I do it because I still feel good enough, and I still have enough joy, and I still laugh and smile with my family and friends enough that it doesn't seem like the right time right now. But it will come, because I feel myself getting sicker. It's happening each week. I still get out and do what I can. I walk with my husband, I walk with my family and my dogs. And things like that bring me the greatest feelings of health that I have these days. But really, it's been just since January 1st, since my diagnosis, it's like health-wise, things keep just getting worse. But I guess that's what happens when you're terminally ill, is you get sicker and sicker.
It sounds so cliche, we take things one day at a time, but it's like that's the only way to get through this. You take away all of the material stuff, all the nonsense that we all seem to latch onto as a society, and you realize that those moments are really what matter.
So the worst thing that could happen to me is that I wait too long because I'm trying to seize each day, but that I somehow have my autonomy taken away from me by my disease because of the nature of my cancer. To really talk to you about the most terrifying aspects. Most recently, my most terrifying set of seizures was about a week or so ago. I had 2 in a day, which is unusual. And I remember looking at my husband's face at one point and thinking, I know this is my husband, but I can't say his name. And ended up going to the hospital for that one. It's a weird feeling to wake up every day and be in my body because it feels so different than it did just a year ago. To be perfectly candid, in the last 3 months, I've gained over 25 pounds. And over nothing I've put in my mouth except for prescription medications. I don't like being photographed, I don't like being filmed, and I don't like spending a lot of time looking in the mirror. And I'm not full of self-hate or loathing, it's just that my body has changed so quickly. You really kind of stop recognizing yourself in a way, and that's very personal. I think sometimes people look at me and they think, well, you don't look as sick as you say that you are. Which hurts to hear because when I'm having a seizure and I can't speak afterwards, I certainly feel as sick as I am.
It's not my job to tell her how to live, and it's not my job to tell her how to die. It's my job to love her through it.
Well, if all my dreams came true, I would somehow survive this. But I most likely won't. So beyond that, I am, having been an only child for my mother, I want her to recover from this.
To counteract tourism abroad for self-administered assisted dying, should we consider shaping Dignitas Sweden? You know, as I said, ending his life, ending one's life, is not criminal, nor is assistance to end one's life in Sweden criminal. In Denmark it is. So there have been recent voices in favor of shaping a sort of Dignitas Sweden. That could be completely legal, given certain precautions taken for shaping this. This is an open question, and I think it will be a question that will remain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Staffan. Our next speaker will be Peg Sandeen, who is the head of the National Center for Death with Dignity in the United States, based in Oregon. And she will tell us about Oregon's path to assisted dying, its model and its evolution, and later she'll come back and talk about some experience and the way forward. Peg?
No need to? It's green now? Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm so happy to be here tonight. My name is Peg Sandeen. As Ellis said, I'm the executive director of the Death with Dignity National Center, and we're headquartered in Portland, Oregon. And I'm a social worker by training. That's who I am. I've been the executive director for 16 years, so I've been around this issue pretty much a long time. And Ellis, you can go to the next slide. Ellis did an introduction. I'm going to talk about terminology, history, the US model, and then I'm going to talk about the Oregon experience and then come back in a little bit. Next slide. So in terms of terminology, you're going to hear me use the term death with dignity, and there's reasons for that. What I do is political work. I go from state to state helping other states adopt death with dignity laws like we have in Oregon, and I'm very interested in what the people support. And the people in the United States call this death with dignity. And so that's the language I use. I reflect what I hear. And so you're going to hear me use the term death with dignity. And I'll just sort of like say my traditional shtick, like politics is emotional, it's relational. And those of us in the room and in the conversations I've had recently have been all these intellectual conversations about should we have this, is this a right? And in my experience as a social worker, I hold the hands of people who are dying. And it's not an intellectual or an academic act to think about how they want to die. It's personal, it's relational, it's emotional, and so that's the language I use. Going to the history of the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, it was passed by a vote of the people. So it wasn't our state legislature that passed the law, the people actually voted for death with dignity in 1994. And I broadly think about, you can go 2 slides ahead. I broadly think about the Oregon Death with Dignity experience in 3 decades. So in the first decade, what we have is we established the policy. So it's the first in the nation in the United States that was accepted and passed. And it's marked sort of by self-administration. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But we established the law. And then for the first 10 or 12 years, there were incredible attacks that came from US Congress, from the Oregon legislature itself, and we ended up in the court system and really couldn't implement the law right away. So it took us a little bit of time to get going. So we established the law, and then we got to about 2006, and the US Supreme Court said, yes, Oregon can have the type of law that it has. And so then we moved into the second decade, roughly the second decade, and what happened after that was a bunch of states, other states adopt the law, and now I would argue that we're in the third decade of the death with dignity movement in the United States, and that decade is marked by sort of more rapid expansion of death with dignity laws, but also consideration of whether or not we should continue with the Oregon model or do some modifications. You can go to the next slide. So here are the jurisdictions with death with dignity. I'm not going to go over this, but in the United States, it's about 70 million people. Next slide. So the underlying concepts, what's the Death with Dignity Act about? It is a patient-controlled process in the United States. So what that means is that it's a prescribing-only law, and people have to self-administer or take it into their bodies themselves. So this distinguishes it from euthanasia and some laws that are around the nation or around the world. There's choice for all participants, so physicians can opt out. They can say, no, I'm not going to do this. In fact, in the United States, entire healthcare systems can opt out. So we have Catholic healthcare systems, and they can opt out. It's a prescribing-only law. I said that earlier, so physicians have to prescribe. There's no other methods that are allowed. It's establishment of a medical standard of care. So this is really important when we think about what is in the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, is that it's all the steps a physician has to follow in order to prescribe a hastened death or prescribe a medication for a hastened death. So that's what, if you think, what is the Oregon statute? It's all those steps that a doctor has to do. I think you can go to the next slide. So in terms of qualification, how does it work? You have to ask your physician for it, and you have to ask orally twice. You have to ask in writing. You have to have witnesses. So there's this entire safeguarded process that you have to go through, and it's statutory, meaning it's written into our law. If you go ahead, the next slide. And I want to talk about my slides just a second. I have a whole bunch of information, and I decided to include that if you wanted to go back and look and understand more, but for the sake of time, I've sort of truncated what I'm saying. You can kind of go forward. One more time. One more time. So this is implementation. One of the things that's interesting is that our opponents had said that Oregon would become this death destination. And I think Staffan talked about the tourism, right? And the reality is very few people in Oregon have used the law. So we've had the law in implementation for 23 years. We have 23 years of data. 1,900 people have ingested medication to end their lives in 23 years. So this is a rarely used law. And this is sort of the arc of the green is the number of prescriptions written, purple is the number of deaths. And then I'll just sort of end up, you want to go ahead to the next slide. What is the Oregon experience? Again, I just said this. We have 2,800 prescriptions written in 23 years, so not many. 1,900 deaths. About a third of the participants go on to not ingest the medication, but to die from their underlying conditions. And this number is kind of the same across all of the states. So about a third of people who qualify, get a prescription, don't use the medication. And then one more slide and I'll be done. So what is the statistics? The age range is from 25 to 102. The median age is 72. These folks are pretty sick. I mean, this is what it is. Most of them have cancer. A few have neurological conditions like ALS. Most of them are white, well-educated. They have insurance, and they're enrolled in hospice. So that's sort of the history of the Oregon law, how it works, and the statistics. And I'll be coming back a little later to talk some more.
Could I ask you just one question, Peg? That was wonderful and very to the point.
To the point.
Yes. I think, I hope I'm not jumping ahead, but I think somewhere you had said that in your documentation that one problem was the cost, that people
Right.
weren't. Are you going to deal with that later?
I'm going to deal with that later.
Okay, then we'll wait with that question. Thank you very much. Okay. Then our next speaker is from Canada, Helen Long, who has a similar position to what Peg has in the United States and is the chief executive of the Canadian organization. Please, Helen.
Thanks, Ellis. And very happy to be here. Thanks to RTVD for the invitation. So I'm with the organization in Canada, Dying with Dignity Canada. It's a national charity that advocates for end-of-life choice, including but not limited to medical assistance in dying. Okay, well, maybe I'll start because I won't be able to truncate quite as much as, as Peg did. So Canada has a long history of support for medical assistance in dying. We started the organization in 1980. Currently, about 87% of Canadians support assisted dying. We're down to 3. Okay, so the law in Canada basically has 2 elements. The first half was the original law, which was developed in 2016. The second half were the amendments to the law, which came about just in March of 2021. Next slide. So in Canada, medical assistance in dying laws are a direct result of a court challenge to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So under 2 sections of the Charter, Section 7, which is the right to life, liberty, and the security of persons. So the right to life, not to have your life unduly shortened, the right to liberty, that you have personal autonomy, and the right to security, which is the ability to maintain your dignity. And then Section 15, which is that everyone is able to have equal protection and rights under the law. Now, important to note that Section 1 can actually limit your rights if the government can prove that it's justifiable, and that will become important a little later. Next slide. So 1993, Sue Rodriguez. Sue had ALS. Her claim in court was that by the time she was able to decide she couldn't enjoy her life anymore and wanted to end it, she would not be physically capable of doing so. So the court ruled that there was not an infringement on her rights, either under Section 7 or Section 15. And even if there was, they felt that it was okay because they were protecting other vulnerable people who might be impacted. So that case was denied, and she ended her life with the support of an anonymous donor in 1994. Next slide. So over 20 years later, Carter versus Canada, this is the case that really created the Canadian law. Gloria Taylor, who had ALS, and Kay Carter, who had spinal stenosis, they used basically the same argument to charge the court. And in this case, the Supreme Court agreed that, in fact, the right to liberty and security in Section 7 were being violated, and that limiting it because of vulnerability was overly broad, and you were in fact deterring people who were not vulnerable from also being able to access assisted death. So next slide, in June of 2016, Canada passed its first assisted dying law, and that's part of our parliamentary process. Next slide. So in Canada, medical assistance in dying, as we call it, or assisted dying, is administration by either a doctor or a nurse practitioner, or prescription by a doctor or nurse practitioner for self-administration. Almost all MAID deaths in Canada are through a physician or a nurse practitioner. Next slide. So in order to access MAID, you must be eligible for health services, so you can't come to Canada to have an assisted death. You have to be at least 18 years old and have capacity to make decisions. You must make a voluntary request that you are not coerced or pressured into doing, and you must give informed consent for the procedure. Next slide. You also must have a grievous or irremediable condition, so you have to be in an advanced state of decline, and you must be suffering intolerably. And initially, under the law, your death had to be what was termed reasonably foreseeable. Next slide. So we interpret reasonably foreseeable, because the government opted not to do that, as reasonably predictable. So that means that considering your age, your factors, your condition, you're on some kind of reasonable trajectory towards death. It is not a year, it is not 2 years, it is not a specific prognosis, so it's largely left to the clinicians to determine what reasonably foreseeable looks like. Next slide. So there's a number of safeguards. I'm not going to talk about those, but there are quite a few. Next slide. So immediately after the law passed, there was a new court challenge. Julia Lamb, who had spinal muscular dystrophy, challenged that because of the nature of her condition, her death would not be reasonably foreseeable, and yet she could suffer extensively for a long period of time. So this case was not decided in court, largely due to the next case, next slide, which was decided. So Truchon, Jean Truchon and Nicole Gladue, they went to court in Quebec. And they had basically the same challenge as Julia Lamb. And in this case, the court determined that both Section 7 and Section 15 were being violated. And in addition, they were being discriminated against because of the nature of their illness. So when this case passed, the federal government opted not to challenge it. So this case has not gone to the Supreme Court. It is a Quebec Superior Court decision. But the government opted not to challenge it. And next slide. We had new legislation in March of 2021 this year. So next slide. In terms of challenges to eligibility, so big changes under the law. The first one is that those with solely a mental illness issue, so individuals who had a mental illness who sought an assisted death, we have what's now called a sunset clause. So in March of 2023, individuals with a mental illness will be able to access an assisted death. Until that time, you must also have another medical condition. The second big change, next slide, was the removal of that reasonably foreseeable eligibility requirement. Next slide. Instead of being an eligibility requirement, that is now a factor in how you access an assisted death. So we have track 1 for those whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable, and track 2 for those whose deaths are not. Next slide. One other significant change, this is Audrey Parker. Audrey was a woman in Nova Scotia who, much like Brittany Maynard, had to make the decision to pick a date at risk of not ever picking a date. So she took her death early. So this change is one that allows you to sign a waiver so that if you lose capacity between the day you set the date for your death and the day your date is to come, the clinician can go ahead with the death. And this, it's interesting to note, this was not a result of a court case. This is purely the government reflecting on the experience showing compassion, looking at the importance of the patient in the process. Next slide. So also some new safeguards for track 2. Someone with expertise in the specific condition must be involved. The assessment must be a minimum of 90 days. The individual must consider all means available to them for relief, and they must have considered them and dismissed them in discussion with their clinician. 2 more. And then just next, what's next? So within that bill, there was also a requirement that the government look at these 5 areas. So we anticipate there will be further review and perhaps change to our assisted dying laws within the next few years based on that. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Very, very interesting, and I'm sure we have other questions and we'll discuss later on. We've now had one country where, in Oregon, where it began, and then we have another country where it was a result of a higher court decision to tell Parliament to enact a law. And now we have a third country, Germany, where we have the vice chairman of the German association that's similar to RTVD, in Dieter Birnbacher, who will tell us about the German case where they don't yet have a law, but where the High Court, their constitutional court, in February a year ago, ruled that this is a human right to have the access to assisted dying.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me to this occasion. I go a bit back into the history of legislation. Assisting suicide has been legal in Germany since 1813. In fact, in Bavaria, in Prussia from 1851, and since 1871 in the Reich. And in the commentary literature, this is traced back mainly to the influence of Enlightenment authors, very critical of the traditional Christian opinion of these matters. Voltaire, Hume, Montesquieu, Beccaria, and in fact in Prussia, which is quite interesting, the punishability of suicide had been abolished by Frederick the Great already in the 18th century, probably under the influence of Voltaire. Oh, how does this function?
Oh,
left-hand side?
Yeah, left should be maybe green.
Perhaps a matter of distance. I add that this legal situation was in fact very much opposed to the traditional Christian doctrine, and the churches in fact have maintained their traditional condemnation of suicide, and along with that suicide assistance in any form up to now. There are certain moderations now occurring at least in the Protestant church. But one interesting document is Samaritanus Bonus of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith of last year, with a very, very rigid condemnation of suicide assistance and the supporting of suicide assistance in all its form. What is characteristic of German legislation is that there is a strict distinction between self-administered, medically aided dying and euthanasia. And this limit is rather strict. Euthanasia has been punishable in all German-speaking countries, whereas self-administered, medically aided dying was punishable until December 2020 only in Austria. It changed when the Austrian Constitutional Court declared that the corresponding law was unconstitutional. And now we see that the very hesitant discussion is gaining ground even in Germany, on the possible legislation of euthanasia, which has only begun after the epoch-making, I mean, this very sort of drastic term, but the epoch-making judgment of the German Federal Constitutional Court in February last year. No, this is too far away. No. Oh, and back was too much. Yeah. And as in Canada, the ongoing process of legalization started in Germany and Austria with complaints before the Constitutional Court against existing legal and professional restrictions. In Germany, the punishability of self-administered medical aid in dying was established in November 2015 by a new paragraph of the criminal law. In Austria, the punishability of self-administered medical aid in dying and of attempts at it is a long-standing Austrian law. What were the motivations behind this astonishing act of criminalization in 2015? On the one hand, it was a certain unease in face of the growing practice of medically assisted dying by societies such as Sterbehilfe Deutschland and Dignitas in Switzerland, dying tourism. These societies were interpreted by many politicians as endangering the autonomy of vulnerable patients who are aggressively seduced into preferring killing themselves to making use of the services of palliative medicine. This was unbelievable from the start, but it was a thought that was behind the political and legal reservations. And of course, there were pressures from the churches and the leading bodies of the Medical Association. And the Medical Association, in fact, introduced in 2011 an explicit prohibition of assisting suicide into the Medical Professional Code, valid for all physicians. And another motivation was the wish to put an end to the offensive public relations activities by the founder of Sterbehilfe Deutschland, a former CDU, Christian Party politician and senator in Hamburg. I mean, this was a well-known figure, and he was continually provoking the political scene with his sometimes really aggressive behavior. But of course, the real danger perceived was the sustained popular preference for a liberal policy regarding medically aided dying, documented by a long series of representative surveys, which were always about 70% pro and 20% contra, and the rest indifferent. At present, this has again increased the proportion of pro opinions. And now the Constitutional Court decision in February last year. As long as the new paragraph 217 of the Penal Code existed, there were several attempts to prevent or mitigate its impact by lawyers. Especially lawyers of criminal law were up against this law from the start. Oh, this is wrong. Moment. Next one. Next one.
Other button, the other left mouse button.
Left button always. Oh, yeah. For example, there was a statement signed by 150 German professors of criminal law against the introduction of the prohibition, and this warning was very interesting because, among others, they said people who wish to die need special care. The criminalization of assisted suicide would lead to a situation in which professional help, which doctors in particular could provide, would become more difficult or impossible because those able to assist turn away from those willing to die for fear of criminal liability. Exactly this happened it became a taboo topic, so that a free conversation between patients and medical people became hardly possible because of this fear of criminal liability. And then the judgment of the Federal Court of Administration in 2017 was a well-meaning attempt to allow for exceptions from this very rigid law. In extreme cases of need, medication producing death should be freely available to patients in so-called extreme cases of need. But all applications, and these were more than 200 up to now, they are added to every day. They have been summarily rejected by order of the Federal Minister of Health, which was an unconstitutional act, as it were, but it was a desperate act to forestall any kind of practice of this kind. In the judgment of February 2020, the court decided that this law was unconstitutional, and it argued primarily with the principle of personal autonomy, and secondarily, in the case of physicians, with the freedom in the exercise of a profession. And in this, which is interesting, it explicitly followed the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, which, however, holds fast to its principle of national sovereignty in this matter. At least in the statement of the European Court of Human Rights in the case Haas against Switzerland, the right of the individual to choose time and manner of its own death was theoretically affirmed. The judgment and the reasoning behind it are unexpectedly radical, so that paradoxically Germany is now the most progressive country in this matter in the world, the most liberal situation. Personal autonomy is part of the core content of human dignity, so it has a very high ranking in the value hierarchy of the law. It has the status of a basic human right, which is a very, very strong assertion. The state has no right to interfere with matters that concern, and this is a literal quotation, with the individuality, identity, and integrity of the individual, including the time and manner of dying, thus replicating the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, who subsumed this assertion among the under the postulate of privacy. An autonomous decision to end one's life must be respected, and this is now important, independently of the individual's condition and situation. Given that certain basic conditions are fulfilled, the decision is taken freely, it is sufficiently informed, it must not result from ignorance, and sustained over a longer period of time, which is not specified. And the state has no right to call into question the subjective evaluation of the respective person of his or her quality of life. And what even more important for the practice side, that the individual has a right to seek assistance in self-administered dying and to make use of it as far as this is freely offered, not only by doctors, but wherever it is freely offered, in fact. And the new thing about this judgment is that it didn't just restore the legal situation before the contested law, but it goes beyond it in two important respects. First, the right to assistance in ending one's life is not restricted to situations of grave, incurable, or fatal illness. It is completely independent. And second, the individual is given an abstract in rem right, a right which is not a claim, not a concrete claim, to obtain medical or non-medical help in realizing his or her death wish. Though no doctor should be under any obligation to help an individual end his life, the individual must have a realistic chance of realizing this intention. So this is really a paradoxical in view of the present situation where only very few doctors are really prepared to assume this role. And now, the present situation, and this is my last commentary, the judgment has encouraged right-to-die societies to offer either medically aided dying to their members in their own right, for example, Dignitas Deutschland, or to mediate contacts with doctors prepared to practice it. But since the number of doctors prepared to practice it is still small, societies are forced to triage member patients according to urgency. There is a selective process which poses a lot of problems for people doing this kind of triage. And there are now in the political sphere several proposals for a procedural regulation for all citizens, not only for members of the corresponding societies. They are going to be discussed next year by the newly constituted Bundestag. Everything is open as far as the present situation and the future situation is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dieter, and very encouraging to see that development in Germany. And now to tell us what the situation is in Sweden and what this decision in Germany and the developments in Europe, what might mean, is a specialist in European law, Walter Guldbrandzén, will talk to us about these issues. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Walter Guldbrandzén, and just like Ellis mentioned, I'm a lawyer in European law. In 2016, I wrote my master's thesis on the right to die under the European Convention of Human Rights. And I've been asked today to talk about the European legal framework and its relevance for Sweden. So, the European Convention on Human Rights It was adopted in 1950 by the Council of Europe, ratified in Sweden in 1952, and made into Swedish law in 1994. In Article 8 of the Convention states that every individual has the right to respect for his private life and family life, his home and his correspondence, and there shall be no interference by a public authority with the exercise of this right, unless there are certain situations or circumstances. I'll get back to that in a moment. And if we look at the case law, that's the right to respect of private life. And next slide. Yeah, so if we look at the case law, just like my colleague from Germany mentioned, there have been case laws from the European Court of Human Rights. There are three cases that I find very interesting in terms of this. The first case is from 2002, and it's Preddy versus the United Kingdom, in which the court found that the way she chooses to pass the closing moments of her life is part of the act of living, and she has the right to ask that this too must be respected. And in 2011, the same court, they found that they considered that it's an individual's right to decide by what means and at what point his or her life will end, provided that he or she is capable of freely reaching a decision on this point in question and acting in consequence. That is one of the aspects of the right to respect to private life within the meaning of Article 8 in the European Convention. And then we also have Gross versus Switzerland, where the court found that it considers that it's the applicant's wish to be provided with a dose of sodium pentobarbital, which is a lethal, can be a lethal medication, allowing her to end her life falls within the scope of her right to respect for her private life under Article 8 of the Convention. This is actually very similar to what has been mentioned from Canada, where the court found that there was an implied right to self-determination under Section 7, and also, like Dieter mentioned, that the German Constitution, they found this right within the German constitutional right to autonomy, which was also interpreted in the light of Haas from 2011. If we move on to the next slide, the court also mentioned that there is a margin of appreciation for the states here. In cases with dealing with these issues, the court has stated that it should be noted that a vast majority of member states seem to attach more weight to the protection of an individual's life than to his or her right to terminate it. It follows that the states enjoy a considerable margin of appreciation in this area. And then in 2012, they repeated a similar thought in which they stated that the state parties to the convention are far from reaching a consensus in this respect, which points towards a considerable margin of appreciation enjoyed by the state in this context. Now, what does this mean? If we go to the next slide, I feel that it's important to point out that a margin of appreciation is not a blank check. It doesn't mean that the states can just do whatever they want. It means that they are to guarantee the right in the context of their own local abilities. And the limitations on interference with the exercise of the right to private life still fall within the objective of having to be necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security, public safety, economic well-being of the country, for the prevention of disorder or crime, protection of health and morals, or the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. But the important part is that it's up to the convention state to show this. The burden of proof is on them. They have to make it seem reasonable. Now, if we look at how it looks under the Swedish legislation, so to sum up, committing suicide is not illegal in Sweden, just like similar to how it was in Germany. Assisting a suicide is not illegal. Euthanasia is illegal. It's considered voluntary manslaughter or second-degree murder. In Swedish, we would call it dråp. But doctor-assisted dying or medical-assisted dying, that's a gray area. It is not criminal, but it could possibly be grounds for losing your medical license. But as I wrote in my thesis, this is actually unclear. It's not clear whether or not you could lose your license. And that in itself is a problem, because you don't know what you're allowed to do. And I think Staffan, our next speaker, will get back to this point. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walter, for a very clear and concise overview of the situation. And as you said, the next speaker will be our chairman again, Staffan Bergström, who will tell us about an actual case from a year ago that he's involved in, and it is now being adjudicated and may even go to the courts eventually. Please, Staffan.
I will present my experience from July last year, when I was contacted by a person who wrote an article, and I, as the chairperson of RTVD, found this article be quite moving, and I contacted this person, and he told me the story that he had been in contact with Dignitas in Switzerland over half a year, and he had cleared all the documentation needed for having end-of-life services at Dignitas. And he had sent in all the translated medical records. He had made all the required preparations in writing and orally, etc. And I found out that he was had everything in order. Now, one day when I talked to him by phone, he was telling me that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the flights to Switzerland had been cancelled. And he had been provided with flight tickets to himself, to his children, to his ex-wife, and everything was set for departure to Switzerland. But he couldn't do that. And his medical condition was that he was suffering from ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and he had a muscular, very advanced atrophy. His respiratory muscles were wasted, and he was extremely meager. He could sit up and breathe with difficulties, and he could not lie down without a respiration mask, a sort of a home respirator, which gave him an overpressure and helped him to be oxygenated by room air. So it was not an oxygen treatment, but it was helping him to sustain in lying down. But he had decided to take off this respiratory machine or this pump, and he was obviously going to die and being suffocated in lying down. And I asked him to talk to his ex-wife, and we talked a lot. And he wrote also an invitation to me to come to see him. I read through every document he had, and he had sent to Dignitas in Switzerland. And I became thoroughly aware of his completely hopeless situation. And he was in a strict meaning of the word limbo, in a mortal or semi-mortal limbo, in which he had three possibilities: either to go with his rollator to the balcony or the veranda on the third floor and try to fall out because he was very weak. Second option was to try to get an overdose of a drug, a fatal drug, narcotic drug, and the last option would be to try to find a weapon to kill himself. So that was my entrance in this situations, in this hopeless situation of limbo in this person's case. And I arrived there, made myself acquainted with his details, and even before that, he had been brought into contact with Dagens Nyheter, and Niklas Orenius, who is a famous journalist at Dagens Nyheter, and also Paul Hansen, who he accepted both of them before I came into the picture, to talk to them and to be interviewed by Niklas and Paul Hansen. And then I came into the picture, and that was the recording of them that I'm going to show 10 minutes now. The film, I have been given the permission by Paul Hansen to show it to you, and it is in Swedish, obviously, but with the English subtexts, and you can follow what he said. He was completely clear to me, and I can tell you afterwards what happened in the aftermath of this visit to him. And I decided, as I will come back to, what to do with his last wish, given the 3 options that I mentioned for his taking his own life. So we can have the film.
Men hur upplever du det här med den här jävlens skjutning?
Jag upplever det som att den förhindrar mig att göra någonting. Den förhindrar mig, den tar livet av dig varje dag. Den förnedrar dig. Det är viktigt. Det är
Men hur upplever du det här med den här jävlens skjutning?
Jag upplever det som att den förhindrar mig att göra någonting. Den förhindrar mig, den tar livet av dig varje dag. Den förnedrar dig. Det är viktigt. Det är en förnedrande sjukdom utan motsvarighet. Och det är jag som säger det. Andra kan tycka andra saker om andra sjukdomar, men jag tycker det.
Men är stolt över när det gäller det? Eller finns det någon sak som du minns särskilt eller någonting?
Jag är mest stolt över att kunna förpacka budskap till människor som gör att de kan enas och se samma bilder och växa. Och det är alltid från att lära ett barn att cykla till att få en företagsledning och förstå att ni måste styra upp er kommunikation. Allt däremellan. Kan man bidra har varit viktigt för mig. Och det är kanske det som gör att jag känner att jag kan inte bidra med något nu.
Men tycker du att ditt människovärde låg i det där bidragandet?
För mig så är det. Men det är också en återspegling i min existens. Jag vill att det här ska få effekt.
Men det här kommer bli... Det tror jag.
Jag vill att det här ska få effekt. Jag vill inte att människan ska behöva göra det här.
Nej, jag förstår. Det var därför jag skrev ur det här. Jag visar det sen. Vi får se sen. Jag gjorde en film om det också. När fattade du beslutet att...
Jag fattade beslutet om att försöka göra allt jag kunde för att styra mitt eget öde. Det kom direkt. Och sen har jag parallellt jobbat mot det hela tiden. Då sätter man igång och ansöker om det och så måste man beskriva sitt liv. Varför man gör det här. Man måste verifiera att den diagnos du har verkligen är sanningsenlig. Du måste fylla i en massa papper på heder och samvete. Du måste tala om att du är du. Du måste kunna verifiera att du är du. Att släkten är det här. Att det verkligen, jag måste till och med ta en röntgenbild hos tandläkaren som skickades ner. För att den röntgenbilden sen skulle kunna mappas mot mig om jag kommer dit och gör det här. Och med allt vad det innebär. Och det sista man ska ha det är ett intyg från neurologen som inte är äldre än 3 månader varje gång. Så jag måste ha uppdaterat hela tiden. Jag har aldrig stuckit under stolen till någon jag har pratat med överhuvudtaget att jag kommer att ta saken i egna händer om jag har möjlighet att göra det. Jag kommer att styra mitt eget öde. Och jag arbetade mig fram emot det här och nu hade jag fått beskedet.
Och du skulle ha gjort det här förra veckan?
Ja.
Vad var det som skulle ha hänt då, som du har förstått det? Om du beskriver det bara, och vilka som skulle varit med och sådär.
Jag, mina 2 barn och deras respektive och min ex-hustru skulle åka med mig ner. Vi skulle ha åkt till Arlanda och flugit ner och handlat till Zürich och sen skulle vi åkt ut till Fors, där det här stället ligger. Och där skulle vi ha fått träffa läkaren vid 2 tillfällen. För att läkaren vill säkerställa att jag är i mina sinnesfulla bruk och att jag är tillräcklig. Att det här är vad jag verkligen vill. Och om det faller väl ut då, så skulle de genomföra den här processen.
Och hur går det till där?
Jag är inte riktigt insatt i 100%, så jag kan inte uttala mig liksom stensäkert professionellt.
Som du har förstått?
Som jag har förstått det så får man ett preparat som gör att du somnar. Och du somnar jättehårt och under den tiden så stängs all ventilation av. Så att det du själv säger, du inmundigar själv medlet du tar. Och det är du som gör det, inte de. De ställer fram grejerna och så tar du det.
Man dricker det? Mm. Och vad är det för medel?
Det vet jag inte heller 100%. Så jag vill inte spekulera i det.
Känner du någon som har gjort det?
Nej, det känner jag inte.
Varför just Dignitas?
Därför att de är de enda som erbjuder det här för människor som inte är medborgare i Holland eller Belgien eller bor i USA eller Kanada. Jag är svensk.
Och hur mycket har du spenderat på det här? Och få kontroll över din egen död?
Jag har säkert spenderat 40-50 timmar på att göra det. På att skriva, hämta, dokumentera, skicka ner, verifiera. Och sen har det kostat mig tillsammans, räknar med att det skulle kosta någonstans från 200 000 att få det här utfört. Med att få några som åkte med mig ner helt enkelt. Rent känslomässigt. Alltså när man gör en sån här sak så är det ju en sak för mig att jag ska ju dö. Men sen ska ju människor leva med det här. Det är en annan sak.
Hur är det?
Ja, jag kan ju bara gå till de gånger då jag har drabbats av att nära och kära har dött på vårt part. Så är det, ja men det är känslomässigt. Och kan man dela det med någon då gör man det. När ens föräldrar går bort så delar man med sina syskon. Och mina barn ska ju också ha dela det med.
Och vad har du fått för reaktioner av de som vet att du ska göra det här?
Av alla, hela min bekantskap, alla. Varenda en, undantagslöst, har ju full förståelse för det här. Jag kan inte svara för om de säger generellt, ja vi ska ha det, utan det finns ju grader i helvetet. Jag sitter med en obotlig, irreversibel, dödlig, plågsam sjukdom. Det här är ju definitivt någonting som jag utan att vara sjuk skulle säga definitivt. Det här faller definitivt under jag tycker att man ska ha läkarassisterat bortgång för. Kontrollerad, professionell, hanterbar form. Enligt rättsprinciper som gör att vi inte får sluttande plan etc. Det finns säkert en miljard andra sjukdomar som jag inte vet ett dugg om, som jag inte kan uttala mig om. Det gör jag inte heller. Så det här är inte svart eller vitt, men det måste finnas någon realism i det. Och det går inte att sitta här och tycka att man är världsbäst i Sverige och peka finger åt hela världen och tycka att hela världen bara är tokig i huvudet, för det är de inte.
Hur fick du kontakt med den svenska läkaren, med Staffan?
Jag fick kontakt med honom eftersom jag skrev ett svar på ett inlägg som låg på Rätt till en värdig döds hemsida. Och då fick jag ett svar från just Staffan som sa: hej Per, jag läste ditt inlägg. Jag undrar om du skulle kunna skriva en artikel som jag skulle kunna få använda i vår tidning. Och om du sen tycker att det är okej att jag skulle kunna skicka den till x antal tidningar. Och då sa jag det att det ställde jag upp på. Så att jag skrev en väldigt kort artikel, väldigt direkt. Och jag är ju reklammänniska, så jag skrev mer ett reklamperspektiv. Men jag ville påkalla uppmärksamhet. Jag ville visa att det får inte vara så här. Och då tyckte han att det var tillräckligt bra för att han skulle förmedla det. Och då rekommenderade han mig att ta kontakt med en annan person som jag gjorde, och tillsammans så skrev vi en annan artikel. Och då säger Staffan att hur långt har du kommit i din process i Dignitas? Och då var det så att jag precis hade fått nej. Jag hade precis fått nej, och då säger han, ja men så här får det inte vara. Och så kom jag i kontakt med Staffan. Jag vill avsluta mitt liv, och han vill ha en debatt. Flytta fram sina positioner. Och jag vill också göra det. Jag delar den uppfattningen.
Så de positionerna är också dina positioner?
Ja.
Och vad hoppas du att det ska, om du ska liksom se, har du ens tänkt så, vad kommer spela ut efter att du har dött?
Jag hoppas att det blir en debatt, och att det kommer till någon form av jättestor reaktion som gör att det här leder framåt. Att vi äntligen kommer i mål på det här. Att vi blir ytterligare ett land som lägger upp det här på bordet och säger, men vänta nu, vi ska ta i det här. Nu ska vi ta i det här. Nu ska vi börja och få fram ett embryo till en lagstiftning som säger det finns vissa omständigheter där vi ska tillåta att människor inom rättsväsendets gränser får avsluta sitt liv på ett värdigt sätt.
Died 24 hours after this film was recorded. And I took the decision after a couple of weeks of contact with him that I had two options, and I had the same repetition to myself when I stood there in his home. Number one, to say, sorry, the Swedish law doesn't admit that I help you to die, and turn around and get out of the door. And then I know that he would take off his mask, as you saw in the film, and lie down and die, because he couldn't breathe, and he couldn't breathe lying down. So I would be out of this apartment, knowing that in this room where he was sitting after lying down, he would be dead. Number two, I could have made what I actually did. I had brought with me medications that I know from experience, and Dignitas use the same method that I left with him. I didn't give him, but I provided him with the medications. And I took a couple of steps back, and the family was with me. And then he swallowed them by his own hands. And I knew beforehand, by talking to legal people, the people in the legal business, that I wouldn't be convicted of a crime after doing so, but I could lose my license, because as Walter Guldbrandzén told, this is a gray zone. So I went to the police and told the police what I had done, and I was sort of taking information from they took information from me, and I was subsequently, after many months, freed from suspicion of having committed a crime. But now what is left, as Ellis mentioned, that is the final judgment, the sort of disciplinary judgment and that implies that except myself going to the police, telling them exactly what had happened, IVO, Inspektionen för vård och omsorg, IVO also went to the police to say that I had committed a crime. And then many months passed, and I am now under the scrutiny of HOSAN, which is a special board in the health, Swedish Health Board of Health and Welfare, and they will probably by the end of this year or early next year give the statement whether or not I will lose my license. And then the next, what is going to happen then, I have three options probably. Either they're taking my license, or they are not taking my license, or they are giving me a warning, sort of a conditional sort of punishment. What will happen then, we don't know, but if I'm punished to be deprived of my license, I will go on to the next level, which is the administrative court, which is förvaltningsrätten, and if they comply with the judgment that I should be taken, I should be delegitimized, being deprived of my license, I will go on to complain, if possible, and I think it will be possible, to the Administrative Court of Appeals, Kammarrätten, and if they consider that they came to the same conclusion, I will apply to the Supreme Court of Administration, Högsta förvaltningsrätten. And then that will be an important step, because public attention to my case will be given more and more and more attention, and I think that would be, I hope, to the benefit of the whole issue of assistance in dying. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Staffan. It's a fantastic thing that Staffan has done, and it may mean a turning point here in Sweden, and we shall see. I want to give not only Staffan an eloge, I want to give Philip, who's a member of our board, who's taking care of all the technicalities. He also did the translation of this film just a couple of days ago, and he asked me as a native speaker of English to review it, and I couldn't find a single word that should be changed. So an eloge to Philip. And now on the program, we've gone almost an hour and a half, and we have two short interventions by Peg and Helen to tell us what's going on now in the future and how they would like to see a perfect program, perhaps. But then we will open up for the panel to discuss with each other up on the stage, and for interventions from you in the public and from those who are watching online. But instead of taking those interventions, I think it's a good time to take our short break. We will take a break of about 10 minutes. It's now 7 o'clock, and at the very latest, by a quarter after, I want everyone to be back and ready to go again. Could we do that, please? Thank you.
Ellis, 1 second.
Yeah?
Can I just say there's still some water and some candies just outside the door, if
Right.
someone like to refreshen.
Yes, there's some candies and there's bottles of water for anybody who would like outside the door.
Also, there are editions, or what is called, of our magazine out there for anyone who understands Swedish who would like to pick one or two with them.
The code for the toilets is 2515. When you go outside, you just follow the corridor around to the left and you will find the toilets. $25.15 is the code. Gunnar Hagberg. Gunnar.
Om du, när det är klart sen, bara le dem till Filip så vet man vad det ska vara. Hej! Hej!
Jag har rest upp på detta för att vara med på middagen och prata lite. Men det har inte varit så många personliga möten på senare tid. Det var väldigt trevligt igår.
Var det ja? Jo, Bert sa just det.
Så att det är klart det går bra att prata på telefon och de här mötena man har på Zoom. Men det är ju helt annorlunda att sitta och prata lite skit.
Du trycker bara kort på den. Då är den på mute. Då funkar den inte. Och sen trycker du igen då så startar den upp. Ja, så helt enkelt. Filip, där ligger du.
Dina barnbarn, det är sitt barnbarn. Nu ska jag gå och pudra näsan innan nu börjar. Hej du!
Kommer du ihåg mig, Birgitta Grönholm? Du minns mig?
Om jag...
Får jag bara störa er innan ni börjar en diskussion? Kollega, hej! Han tar andra sidan med micken, så kan ni jobba från båda hållen.
Ja, jag visst inte i mitt.
Förlåt.
Nu måste jag gå och pudra näsan innan. Gör man det?
Var?
Finns det en toalett här?
Ja.
Jag hör inte vad du säger, vänta lite.
We would have short interventions, about 5 minutes each, from Peg and from Helen on any problems they see with their respective programs and how they would envision an optimal program. So could you please, Peg, begin?
So when I think about the issues with the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, and again, I've been there 16 years, and so I've been thinking about this a long time. And I think the issues fall into a couple of different areas. And the first area, I would argue that we have issues or concerns with the Oregon Death with Dignity Act is that because of the way the law is constructed, it sits within the practice of medicine. So any challenges or problems that we have in the United States in the practice of medicine can be replicated in our law. And if you think about like the practice of medicine in the US, it's a bit of a mess. I mean, compared to what you all have, we don't have a right to health. We don't have a right to health care in our country. We have a country where health care is a commodity. And so it's to be bought and sold. It's related and tied to capitalism. And so in that, we have tremendous challenges related to access and cost. So, for instance, if you live in a rural area that doesn't have a lot of physicians and you don't have access to transportation, even getting to a doctor is really hard. So, and that would be your oncologist, your cardiologist. And so if you have that problem in medicine and then you extend that to death with dignity, you might have a problem finding a physician if you live in a rural area. So that's one of the issues so that's the access issue. And then there's the cost issue. So we have a federal law that says that no federal US dollars can be used to support death with dignity. And so that means that our Medicaid and our Medicare programs, these are programs that provide for the health care of poor individuals or individuals over 65 or individuals with a disability. None of those federal dollars can be used to support death with dignity. And so if you want to ingest the medication, you have to pay for it yourself. You have to pay for your visits to your physician. Because there's 2 physicians involved, you have to pay for 2 visits for your physician or more. If you have to go through a mental health evaluation, you have to pay for that yourself. And recently, the cost of Seconal went to about, so this is another thing about the US healthcare system, the cost of your medicine is based on your health insurance. So whatever health insurance plan that you have, that determines how much cost your medication. So Ellis and I might take the same medication. He might pay $250 a month. I might pay $1. And so it's hard to tell you how expensive this medication got, but I heard that it went up to about $4,000, which meant that it was completely inaccessible if you were poor. Higher? Did you pay higher? Yeah. So and I hear this, or I paid lower because we have this strange US health care system. And the other piece about our healthcare system is we have racial discrimination sort of as part of the system. So institutional racism is part of medicine. And when you look at the usage of the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, 96% of people are white. And so we have this thing going on with race that we don't really understand, I would have to say. We haven't solved the problem of why people of color don't use the Oregon Death with Dignity Act or the laws like it around the country. So it's because it sits within medicine, all of the problems in medicine we inherit. And then people ask us to fix those problems related to the Death with Dignity Act, and they're really not problems within our law, they're problems within medicine that we can't solve. So that's the first issue. And then the second issue that I see, I fly around the country and I help other states adopt Death with Dignity Acts like we have in Oregon. And one of the things that's sort of maybe an artifact of the United States is that one state doesn't want to adopt another state's laws. So Minnesota doesn't want Oregon's law. They want their own law. And so they base it on Oregon's law, but what they do is they add an extra safeguard or an extra protection, because then they have a better law than the Oregon law, even though the data demonstrate that it works very well. And so what happens is you get all of these extra safeguards that are added on that actually create more barriers to access. And so each sort of iteration, we have 11 laws now, you know, they're all just a little bit different, and they're starting to become more restrictive. And so that's the problem, is we want to make sure we ensure access. If we're bringing Massachusetts, New York, big important states on board, we want to make sure that they have more access and not less. So those are the two main issues that I see with the Oregon Death with Dignity Act.
Could I just ask you, Medicare and Medicaid are federal laws. Is there any prospect of getting a national law on death with dignity?
In the US Congress? Can that be my answer?
Enough said. Thank you, Peg. And now Helen, please.
I'm just going to stay up there.
You may as well sit here. Everyone's going to come up after Helen.
Okay, well, after that, I'm happy to say we have a few more problems, but they're much smaller in scale. So the biggest, one of the first things, I should say is with the changes that came about in March of 2021, a number of the problems that we encountered and the challenges that we faced early on have been eliminated. So that's all good news. Reasonably foreseeable, I talked about that earlier. The interpretation of that has been a problem. Thanks to the work done by the Association of Clinicians that is in Canada, we do now have practice standards and guidelines, and that's made a big difference. There is a lot of confusion among Canadians, though, when they read the law and they read the criteria to understand what that means. Okay, I think we're 4 along. Next one, yep, right there. These safeguards are safeguards that were eliminated in 2021. These, though, did create continued suffering for people, challenges in accessing or invading privacy in order to access witnesses, having to stop taking pain medication or take your death early because you weren't able to, you had to maintain capacity. These have fortunately all been eliminated in the new legislation. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but important to note, those were changes brought about because of compassionate, thoughtful processes at Parliament, not because the law was required to change because of the court challenge. Next slide. While the number of clinicians we have does continue to grow, considering the size of our population and the number of clinicians that we have, the geographic region, it is still small, so in remote and rural communities, it can be difficult to access clinicians. COVID has obviously exacerbated that just because of the overall burnout and strain on the healthcare system. Some clinicians do prefer not to participate because of conscience rights, which they can do in Canada. Some provinces, Ontario, where I live, has a referral policy. So you must make an effective referral if you're a clinician to someone else or another service that will support a person in assisted death. Some provinces don't have very strong processes, and people are often left hanging if their clinician is not prepared to support them. There's no payment model for nurse practitioners. So there are nurse practitioners who do this work for free, and that's been a challenge. It means that we're also not able to access as many nurse practitioners as we could because there's no way to pay them. The new system, Track 2 patients, the system is much more complex. So they're complex cases, often with a variety of conditions, more difficult to diagnose. There's a longer assessment period, so there's a burden on the clinician, both through the process but also administratively, as they have to manage that care for a longer period. Next slide. Some public health care facilities, generally those who claim a religious affiliation, will not allow medical assistance in dying on site. So people who are at end of life and in intolerable suffering who are in the place they may consider home are forced to transfer out in order to receive their death. Next slide, concerns from the disability community. We heard a lot during the bill about these concerns, and that's why you see track 2 and the additional safeguards. We also saw the government commit to further review of the protections that were needed, so we'll see that hopefully in the next year or two. Next slide. So I think I mentioned this earlier as well, because this law is federally legislated, that's easy, but it's provincially regulated, which means every province, much like Peg's example of every law is a little different, every process and set of regulations in Canada is a little different. So depending what province you're in, we have some provinces that are single door, you walk through, everything's taken care of, and some provinces where you're running from place to place trying to get support. We do find some confusion for Canadians. You know, what will happen when the mental illness exclusion ends? What will the law look like? How will that work? We don't know those answers because that work hasn't been done yet, but that does create confusion and concern for people. That waiver of final consent I talked about earlier, we have advanced consent, we have a waiver of final consent, and we have people who want an advance request. So the similarity of that language is very confusing. Advance requests would be a situation in which you would describe a future state, much like an advance directive. That is not legal right now, but that is the #1 thing that Canadians would like to see change. And then last, we've got that review coming up. We just had an election, so things have been very delayed, but we hope to see that start again by the end of the year. And then finally, last slide, optimal program. So, you know, our system is not perfect. We do think it works quite well, and given the fairly short tenure that we've had the law, things have progressed well for us. You know, making sure there's a balance of autonomy and freedom of choice, safeguards not becoming barriers, which Peg spoke to. The big thing for us moving forward is ensuring what the patient wants and what the clinician is prepared to do are aligned. As we talk about advanced requests, we're hearing that there's a big gap there, and how do we resolve that? What do we do with that? And then just trying to align standards across the country a bit so the experience in each province is a little closer to the same thing regardless of where you are. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Helen. Could I ask all of the other panelists to come up and join us for the general discussion and question and answer period? And I'll start it off myself with a question to Peg while the others are coming up. About 1/3 of the people who receive or get the grant to be able to go ahead with the assistance in dying in Oregon never take the medication themselves. And I only know of anecdotal evidence, and I'd like to know if this is actually the case or not, that a number of these people actually live longer than they would have otherwise because they're confident that when things really get bad, they could take that medication. And some people might have to, like my former stepfather-in-law, who took his own life when he was losing things. Maybe he would have lived longer if he had had a medication prescribed that he could take later on.
This is oops, let me bring it closer here. This is really complicated, Ellis. And this is known in the medical literature as the Oregon paradox. So in Oregon, we have really good palliative care. We have a solid hospice system. In terms of ranking of all of the states that you might say are good places to die, Oregon is a good place to die. Florida is a bad place to die. And so what you're referring to is this concept that what happens is if you just have someone with a terminal illness and they just get treatment and treatment and treatment and treatment and treatment, which is what we do in the United States, we commodify health, then that treatment is so toxic to your body that you tend to, or the thought is you die earlier than if you stop that treatment and just focus on palliative care and you live out your life. And so you kind of step away from the medical community And because you're not sort of inundating your body with toxic chemicals that are treatment chemicals, then you might live a little longer. There's not data about this. This is sort of philosophic. We can't measure, statistically, this would be known as measuring the non-event. We can't tell what would happen if you continue treatment or if you don't, so it's not possible statistically really to know this concept. But I think that we do have this experience in Oregon, and I think that we'll see more and more conversations about this. But this is a really difficult question to answer. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I'll open up for questions. We have two wandering microphones in the audience, and we also have from the internet. If we want to begin with the audience that's here, is there anybody who would like to pose a question or make a comment? Please.
Thank you very much. So my question is, there are many democratic countries around the world, like Sweden, where a majority of the population are for some form of medically assisted dying, yet it remains prohibited. I wonder, why is that the case?
I wish I had the answer. We have some very reluctant political parties. We have some courageous politicians, but unfortunately they're very few. Would you like to comment on it, Barbara? Barbara Westerholm is a member of parliament, and she is on our side.
Yes, the Liberal Party wants an investigation. Work is going on within some of the political parties now in favor of a parliamentary investigation, but I doubt it will be something real this year, but maybe during the next mandate period. And we can see also among physicians, which is a very important group here, that views are changing. And I'm very glad to see that young physicians become more and more interested in this matter, discussing the freedom of choice to decide for yourself. So I'm sure we will get it in the end, but it takes time in a country like Sweden, and it's very important now in the political world that in countries like Spain, Portugal, and so on, come onto the scene and introduce assisted dying, so and also euthanasia. So I'm hopeful, but not being a reality tomorrow, but a bit later.
Thank you very much, Barbara.
I hope to live until the day it becomes true.
Before I give the floor to somebody else in the audience, does Rolf have anybody online who? You need a mic here.
Thank you. My name is Rolf Alsen. I'm part of the board here. I would just like to support what Barbara said by saying that I'm teaching medical students, and it's obvious that they are very interested. And it's also clear that they have we've seen from students trying to make investigations among their fellow students that there is a tendency that they get more positive. But I have a question from Ingrid Kuhlman, who is from Iceland. I think she's the chairman of your organization in Iceland, Ingrid Kuhlman, and she asks, which is in line with the discussion now, she asks, what is the stand of physicians in Germany, Sweden, Canada, and Oregon? So what is the position on this matter among physicians? We know about Sweden because we just made a poll. Maybe you can start with that, Staffan. The Swedish, we made an investigation recently.
Yeah, we made the Karolinska Institute where I was working. They made a study in 2007 among a widespread number of specialties, and I think that the percentage of doctors, colleagues of mine, who were positive to assisted dying were 34%. And now, last year, the same department made the repeat study among the same specialties, and the percentage had increased to 47 from 34 some 14 years ago and up to 47. And interestingly, as Barbara said, the younger strata of these doctors, they were more positive. So that is encouraging.
Okay. Gunnar, you have someone there? Yes?
Yes, I have a question with regard to the situation in the US at the present moment. There is a discussion going on, particularly in Texas, on the abortion. Do you fear that this might have a sort of negative impact on your work?
Thank you. And while you're answering to that, Rolf pointed out we didn't answer the person's question about what's the attitude of doctors in the other countries now, in Germany, in Canada, in US.
We have a particular problem in the United States. I would call it a problem from where I sit politically, that we have moved much further to the right, and our Supreme Court has moved much further to the right. So the threat to the Oregon Death with Dignity Act would either be that the Supreme Court decides that we can't do it, and they make that decision. The challenge would be whether or not a case could get there. And we don't believe that a case could make its way up to the Supreme Court because of the way the Oregon Death with Dignity Act is structured. In our country, medicine is controlled by the states, and that is decided law. So it would be really hard for a case to sort of challenge that and make its way up to the court. If our opponents managed to do that, we would be at risk. So, and the other way that the Oregon Death with Dignity Act could be at risk would be if Congress decided to say no state can do it in our country. And the Congress does have the power to do that. They've not been willing to do that. I even think with our Congress that they won't. I think the Texas abortion challenge is really trying to get a case to the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade. Whether that's a danger to us, I think we have common opponents, certainly, but they have a much higher burden of getting a death with dignity case up to the court than a Roe v. Wade case up to the court. And then in terms of Oregon physicians, there's two ways to think about this. One is the number of physician supporters, and then the number of physicians who are willing to write a prescription. So those are two different numbers. The challenge in Oregon is because we've had the law for so long, nobody's really collecting data about specifics like this. We have, the way the law is written, we have to report to the state issues a report, but it's not incredibly detailed at this level. We do know that over 50% of Oregon physicians, well over 50% of Oregon physicians are supporters. I don't really know what the upper limits of that number might be, 60%, 70%, because we really haven't asked the question. And so it's just the number of prescribers, and I would just be able to say that every year we have more and more prescribers around the state. And I feel pretty good with where we are in terms of physicians in Oregon.
Thank you. Would Helen and Dieter like to respond also?
Yeah, so Canada would very similarly echo Oregon. I think what's interesting to note is the clinicians, both clinicians who support medical assistance in dying, but more particularly those who administer it, because as I mentioned earlier, in Canada it is almost always physician administered. We get a wide range of specialties. So although general practitioners or family doctors make up the largest component, we have geriatric, palliative care, psychiatrists, quite a broad type of doctor that is willing to participate, and that has, I think, led to increases in areas where we may not get them otherwise.
In Germany, there are 2/3 of all practicing physicians would, under certain conditions, be prepared to participate in assisted dying, especially by self-administered assisted dying. Euthanasia is out of the question. But this is not very informative, because most physicians who sympathize with this kind of praxis do not practice it. There is a certain psychological threshold which has to be transcended, and the decisive step is not taken. So very many patients are rejected. And this is the problem at the present, because this freedom physicians have is not used. And of course, here arises the question of when is conscientious objection really honest? Are there reasons of conscience? No, I think in most cases it is not reasons of conscience, but reasons of caution, fear of being stigmatized in one's professional surroundings, or the fear that the law is not explicit and clear enough to be free of legal prosecution. And this, of course, can be changed and will be changed, I think, but this is a long process.
Thank you. I neglected to mention that while you all understand English, some people might be more comfortable putting their question in Swedish, and that's perfectly all right, and I'd be glad to translate any, but that. Gunnar?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Anna Kira, and I represent the board at the Norwegian Right to Dignified Death organization. And I wanted just to give some stats because people were asking about countries, and we have the population 70% approve the idea and would like it, but with doctors we only have 15%, and with politicians we only have one party, small party. So we are in the Stone Age. And I have lots of reasons. I would love to discuss with this politician what I think are the reasons why Scandinavia is so way in the Stone Age. As an anthropologist and a psychologist, I have some ideas, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I actually have a question or a thought. Well, I have two things, a thought and then a question. Sometimes the answer is right in front of your nose. And first I want to say that I really commend Staffan for what he has chosen to do, and I'm so proud. And it just really moved me, so thank you for that. I think it's a very important thing. And while I was listening to, and I forgot to thank all of you for this most amazing all these presentations. I just really wanted to thank you all. Because the other answer right in front of my nose was when Walter was speaking. And it suddenly occurred to me that Norwegians, we don't like conflict. We avoid it like the plague, so we've been sitting in these board meetings and we talk and we talk and we complain about the politicians who don't do this and that. But the answer is right there. Sue the bastards, sorry, sue the state. So that's my take-home message from this conference, is that it's time to sue and keep proving challenging the current laws all the way to the European councils. So thank you, Walter. And then I wanted one question I have. And that question has to do with the Oregon law. I was in a debate with the head of the Board of Medical Ethics. And under his breath to me, he's for it in one way or another. But what his main argument against the Oregon law was it was discriminatory. And he wasn't concerned about what you were talking about with race. He was saying it had to do with not allowing ALS patients and others. So how do we handle that kind of argument? That's my question. How do we handle that to just be able to get the basic law passed? We can work on all the way to advanced directives in the future, but just the basics.
Yeah, the context of that, just to fill that out a bit is that because of the self-administration mandate, some people with certain disabilities don't have the ability to ingest the medication, and so that's the underlying principle related to this argument. My answer to that question would be that the Oregon Death with Dignity Act was, and this is a hard answer to say, but the Oregon Death with Dignity Act was construed narrowly and somewhat intentionally to be about self-administration. And so that meant that there were people left out of the Oregon law. And that's hard for me as a social worker to say, like, you don't qualify. But what we've done in our state is establish this tension of creating a law that allows for a hastened death for a certain population, but also safeguarding and protecting others. And so our law sits in that tension, and in that tension, which tends to work, a few people do get left off. And I just have to acknowledge that. 8% of people who use the Oregon Death with Dignity Act historically have had ALS, so some folks with ALS and other neurological conditions have been able to use it. But I would argue it is a problem, but also somewhat the way the law is designed.
Thank you, Peg. I would direct a question to Walter. You said it's a gray area. How would you, or what do you think, or what would you recommend that we could do now in Sweden to challenge, to somehow get to the European Court of Human Rights that this is a human rights issue? Now, with the rulings in Germany and Austria, and Spain has adopted a law, and so on and so forth.
Well, I think what you can do, I think it is on. Okay. Thank you. I think what we can do is what Staffan is already doing, which is starting a court case, essentially, because whatever the medical board decides, it is up for the jurisdiction of the administrative court to try it. So if we assume that he will lose his license, there is a possibility to appeal, and that's how you take it to court. And then, depending on how that, falls out in court, but if we assume that he loses in the Supreme Court, that's how you get it to the European Human Rights Court, which is actually the only way to get it to the European Human Rights Court, because you have to exhaust all the local courts in order to get there. So that's how you do it. So basically, you're doing what you can do, essentially. The only thing I find is a bit frustrating from a viewer's perspective is that it's taking so long. But that's kind of just how courts work. But yeah, you're doing what you can do as far as I see it.
Let me just follow up on that briefly. If he's exonerated, or if he's given a slap on the wrist without losing his license, would that be a sufficient prejudicat well, there would have to be several more cases like that where it would be an established practice then, where there were no recriminations for having given a help.
Well, if he gets to keep his license, the way I see it is that will probably, like, depending on how they reason when they reach their decision, but my guess is that would not lead to any dramatical change. It will basically just take us back to where we were, in the sense that, okay, we know that, Staffan did this and he did get to keep his license, but we don't know what specific circumstance made that happen, and that could make doctors nervous. And it kind of goes back to the problem of, if we listen to the European courts, they say that, well, this is a right. But the way the Swedish law is so unclear in whether or not how to actually access this right. It prevents people from accessing it. So that in itself is a problem as far as I see it. Yeah, to answer your question, the slap on the wrist, well, I mean, you can appeal that. You can appeal that, definitely. That's a way of trying it. But a complete exoneration, I think that would just basically bring us back to square one, in a sense.
Thank you. We have a question down here.
Staffan, my name is Jerker Hansson. I'm a psychiatrist here in Stockholm. Staffan, I wonder what meaning and impact will your appeal have? Your talk in your appeal was that the medication was to prevent coughing, not to make the patient die. So there is a difference there. Will it be okay to give medication to prevent coughing, but not we will not know anything about possibilities to give drugs for making a person die?
It's a tricky question. I have in my correspondence with Ivo and Hosan, the National Board of Health and Welfare, I have argued that since this man had qualified in writing from Dignitas to, according to the Swiss law, had qualified to have his life ended, and he was about to take off his mask lying down, and so I was helping him to not suffer like a respirator patient asking for taking away the respirator. Then we are entitled, according to the Swedish law, to switch off the respirator and make the anesthesia working. So what I did basically, that was when he was taking away his breathing mask, which he did, and then he took his medication. What I did was exactly the same or similar to what I would have done had he been on a clinical hospital-based respirator, asking the doctor to take away that or removing that himself or herself, and then they're asking for anesthesia to diminish the suffering of suffocation, which I wrote this clearly in my defense and in my appeal to the National Board of Health and Welfare, whether they will accept that similarity of respirator switching off and his own taking away the breathing mask and giving, in my case, the providing him with the tablets to avoid suffering, and in a clinical situation with that doctor allowing the one with the respirator deprivation to sleep into death. That is, I don't know what they are accepting that or not.
Okay, the floor is still open. Do we have any more on the streaming?
No, we don't.
Okay. Then from the public, yes? Yes, wait, you get the microphone.
Thank you. I have a question about what the current situation with the pandemic of coronavirus and all the elderly people who have died during this process, although everyone said that we have to do everything, our best to save, do our best for the elderly people. They have suffered a lot. And I wonder if you have seen anything influence on the public opinion concerning the issue of the right to decide of your own death in connection with that. I mean, maybe there are many more people who have died who didn't want to die than there are now people who have not been able to continue their own death although they wanted to. And I'm a little wondering what the consequences will be if it will make the situation for the right to your own death more difficult, and it will take longer time to get that.
As you may have read in the Dagens Nyheter at the time when a few cases were up to discussion, some elderly people were left in so-called palliative care to die. But the professor, a famous professor in Umeå, said that this was similar to dödshjälp, assisted dying. But I mean, this was, I wrote a protest in Dagens Nyheter to this statement, because this has nothing to do with dödshjälp, assisted dying, because these patients hadn't even asked to die. And they were obviously victims of a very, very threatening disease, and bring them to be sort of terminal cases, but there was no existing questioning about willingness to die. So it was completely misdirected criticism.
Yeah, but I mean, when you talk about the numbers of people who were not able to help,
It's I think it's. I think it's much too early to be able to get any real answers on this. Careful. Yes, Helen?
Yeah. So in Canada, we had, initially there were a lot of people reaching, not a lot, but there were people reaching out and saying, oh, if I get COVID, can I have an assisted death? And technically, at the right point in time, could you? Probably. But the reality was, for people in, who were much older and who were already in compromised health and who were often in an institutional situation, there would never be the time for that to happen. We had a couple of situations with long-term care facilities in Canada that were quite shameful, where people did not receive the care they should have. There was no connection or tie to them having an assisted death or wanting an assisted death. It was just poor management and poor action on the part of some privatized care facilities. When we look at the numbers for 2020 and what happened, there's not even enough COVID deaths that it counts on the reporting, and the numbers have gone up year over year in a fairly steady manner. So we don't see anything over the course of 2020 that it would lead us to believe that there was any connection there at all.
In the United States, a couple of things. One, calls to our social workers at the very beginning of the pandemic with requests for information about how to access the law plummeted. So, like that February, March, April, we just had very few kind of people calling to ask about it. But if you look at the Oregon numbers that I provided, or you can find them online also, we did have a spike last year in use of the Oregon Death with Dignity Act. I think that it's the same in California. There's a spike. I haven't looked in all of the 10 states, 11 states to see this. So, but as Ellis says, it's a little early to know what that spike means, because usage of the Oregon law has gone like this, and then it kind of goes like when Brittany Menard so courageously did what she did. We saw more usage because we believe that the public was more aware of it. Her story was in the media. So we do have this spike in Oregon and California, the two kind of big states, but we don't know what it means yet. It's just a little too early to know.
Rolf, did you have another question from?
I have a question from Göran Lamberts to Peg. What was the prime success factor? What has been the prime success factor behind the legislations in the one state after one another in the United States? If you can mention at least one or some.
So I think some of the success or the reason why we have achieved policy reform in the United States, one of the things that we do is we try to make this nonpartisan in the United States. And I kind of like shared a little bit about my own political feelings. I have my own political feelings, clearly I do. But if we organize from the left or from a progressive position and try to come to the middle, there's not a way in the United States to achieve death with dignity. And so what we do, and where we have done it successfully, is we organize from the middle, because we have folks who are both conservative, we have folks who are progressive, who come together with a common issue that we all die. And so they come together and sort of put aside politics, if we're able to do that in the United States now. I mean, that's really complicated. But I would argue that that's one of the key strategies for success, is organizing from the middle. And the other piece is the telling of personal stories. And I heard someone in the audience say, you're sort of an intellectual, you're nice, you're polite to each other, we have this in Portland, we call it Portland nice. But what we try to do is we don't tell stories about doctors. And you have a fabulous story. We tell stories about patients, because that tends to resonate with people. Like all of us have a mother, and all of us, our mothers have one death. And that's really important to us. That resonates deep down within us. And that makes people vote with us. That makes, legislators come to a hearing, hear someone's story about their mother or their child, and make a decision to vote with us. And so I think that, two keys to the success that we have is both how we've done organizing politically and the use of personal stories to move the issue along.
Thank you, Peg. That was excellent. I would like to now start to round off the evening, and I would ask the members of the panel, each one, if they want to make any final comments, and then I would make a couple of final comments. Did you have one more question, Rolf?
Well, I had a question myself to Dieter, but maybe...
Okay, yeah, go ahead, take it.
Yeah, well, that's like to ask you, Dieter, it is maybe one of the most amazing developments during the last years have been exactly what happened in Germany after 2020. And it's a sort of groundbreaking, because we all thought about Germany as a sort of bastion against this. Now, is there this, the authority of the Verfassungsschutz must be very strong, because it has sort of turned around the situation. Is there a unanimous, is there a support behind this shift, or are there strong resistance to shifting the ground in Germany?
Sorry, I haven't got everything you asked, but I think you asked about the present situation and the radical shift that happened by this constitutional judgment. It was radical legally and politically, but it corresponded to the majority opinion of the population. And the lecture that this shows us, the lesson we can draw from this process, is that public pressure is the most potent factor in changing the political situation. And without this public and, reinforced by the press, by the media, and this huge number of media, TV, for example, films and videos on particular cases of assisted dying, which are really growing more and more from year to year, this public pressure is invaluable, and it subliminally, implicitly determines very many political and legal decisions. And without it, it would be unthinkable. And this is a long process, and one has to have patience, after all. And this process, I think, will be going on with the new generation, with the growing secularization of society, and the shift towards an even more increased life expectancy, and so on. And there is a convergence of tendencies that will lead to some liberalizations, not only in Europe.
Thank you. Then I think we start to round off and see if any of the panelists or all of the panelists would make any final remarks. Walter, do you have anything?
Well, I can say that my sort of own reflection on this as a Swede is that, 80% of the population of the progressive Sweden wants this. 47% of the doctors wants this, some sort of form of death with dignity, and we don't have it. And this is a problem for people who are wanting to die with dignity, but can't. So it's a problem for them, but it's also a potential problem for anyone and everyone, because we are all gonna die. And cancer and ALS doesn't care about race. It doesn't care about how rich or poor you are. It doesn't care what religion you belong to. So this could potentially affect anyone. And again, 80% of the population wants this, and we don't have it. Catholic Spain got it before progressive Sweden. I'm not sure we can call ourselves progressive anymore. That is my statement. Thank you.
Dieter, do you have anything you want to add now? Dieter, do you want to say anything more?
Sweden has a very progressive image all over Europe, and this is completely justified in most respects, in fact. But what I really wondered that the figures of public support of assisting dying are highest in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, in the Scandinavian countries. But at the same time, there is no legislation in these countries, which is quite contrary to what one might expect. And obviously, there is too much harmony in these societies. There is not enough protest, not enough sort of scandalization. And I think this is a very important force. And it might be supported by scandals that happen, and, for example, by court decisions that are sort of felt to be scandalous by a large majority.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Helen?
Maybe just to say that, while we've been, I guess, fortunate in having court challenges that have supported the assisted dying laws in Canada, if you think back to my presentation, I deliberately include pictures of the people along the way, because much like Peg's group, we tell a lot of stories, and those stories touch people, and they move people, and they inspire them, and that all creates change. And we have seen that very clearly in the last law, where 4 or 5 of the changes made, including the one very significant one around advanced waiver of final consent, those were made because of the people involved, because of the stories, and because of the compassion and the suffering, and the need to look at it from a patient-centric position, not because of the court challenges. So I think, your people also drive letter writing, and they drive pressure on politicians, and that's where you just need to keep doing that and build that momentum, because we have seen that have incredible power in Canada.
Thank you. And Peg?
I don't have anything extra to add. I think Walter started this off where we could have ended it, actually, because his statement was so strong. But what I would add is this idea that there's two components to public support, and one is your public support. In the United States, our public support is way lower than yours. It's about 72, 76%. That's actually substantial when you think about election numbers. But the other component to think about is this idea of how important or how urgent the issue is. And so I would guess that the urgency is lower here. Like, you have high levels of support, but we haven't been able to demonstrate that this is an important issue to take care of this year. That's the piece that you need to, I feel like you need to get over, to be able to demonstrate that not only we all support it. You're going to ask someone walking down the street, they're going to say, yes, they support it. But we need them to be able to say, and this is an important issue to take care of right now. And that's, I'll just go back to the stories. That's what the stories do for you, is they bring the issue really to the forefront. And I just want to say thank you. I love Sweden. I love being here. And you've been a great audience.
Staffan?
I think I would like to confirm what Helen said about personal stories. We in distant Sweden from this continent west of us, we have heard many times the name of Gloria Taylor. And you saw Brittany Maynard in my film. And these people have made an enormous impact on people's mind, seeing them with a deadly disease and having seen them being decisive of ending their lives with very good arguments and presenting their face, etc. In Sweden, we have had this patient of mine who was brave enough to call himself an ambassador of assisted dying. And that was why he, before I came into the picture, had decided to talk to Niklas Orenius and Paul Hansen of Dagens Nyheter. So he made it himself, even if I assisted him in sort of trying to formulate much more film. So I think, and we have another Swedish lady living in France whose name is Elisabeth Abelin Norell, and you may have heard of her in the Swedish television. The magazine V has presented a fantastic story about her last days and her views on this. And in the magazine M, there will be another longer story about Elisabeth Abelin Norell. And I think we need these stories to make concrete faces and human beings of what we are talking about. And the last thing I would like to say, that I have come to the conclusion, when we have an untapped source of healthcare people. I have mobilized a couple of hundred doctors who have been signing articles and appeals in Läkartidningen and in Dagens Nyheter, in Dagens Samhälle, and that is a sort of a mobilization. But we have not yet asked about nurses in palliative care and assistant nurses, undersköterskor in palliative care. We have something phenomenal in Sweden called Palliativregistret in Kalmar in southern Sweden, where all people dying, except for very acute things like cardiac infarction and accidents, etc., they are going to be registered there in terms of remaining pain, dyspnea, nausea, anguish, and all these things. And we know from scientific studies that 10 to even 15% during the last week of life have not been freed of these pains and nausea, dyspnea, etc. So we have enormous amount of information to be tapped from these sources, and assistant nurses, and doctors.
Thank you, Staffan. And I would like to wind up briefly with 3 points. One, we were talking about whether Sweden is progressive or not. In one sense, we're very progressive. I have one more slide, if Philip can find it. We're very progressive about our animals. The latest version of the Swedish Animal Protection Act from 2018, but went into force from 1st of April 2019. Are you finding it, Philip? There we go. Okay. I made the free translation, but I think it's pretty accurate of what the law says, but it's not authenticated. I have it here in Swedish if anybody wants to check. Chapter 4 on the care of animals and operative measures has a section on care of injured or sick animals. And that can be a dog or a cat or a horse or a cow, a chicken, whatever animal you want. An animal that is injured or sick shall as soon as possible be given necessary care or be put down. That's the English phrase for ending the life. If the injury or sickness is so severe that the animal is subject to such serious suffering that can't be alleviated, then the animal shall be put down. That's the law. You're breaking the law if you don't help your animal. And the animal hasn't even asked for assistance. But we, human beings who ask for assistance, we don't have the right today in so-called progressive Sweden. So we're progressive about our animals. The second thing I'd like to say is that RTVD is a small organization. We have only about 2,100 members. We have no office, we have no staff, our elected officials receive no sitting fees or other compensation. So if you approve of what we are doing, please become members and/or make contributions. And finally, I just want to say again a huge thanks to Peg and Helen and Dieter, who have taken time from their busy schedules to come and help us, and with no compensation, just reimbursement of some basic expenses. And a big thank you also to Walter for his contribution, and a big thank you to Philip and other members of the board who have done so much to make this possible. Thank you all very much.